The November wind came down off the Bighorn Mountains like something with teeth, carrying the smell of snow and pine smoke across the Wyoming plains. It cut through wool and leather and skin, found every gap in every seam, and reminded anyone foolish enough to be outside that winter. In this country didn't ask permission. It simply arrived. Jessamine Wren pressed her fingers against the leather satchel in her lap and watched the land roll past through the stagecoach window. Miles of brown grass bent flat by the wind, fence posts standing like sentries against a sky the color of old iron. Cattle huddled together in the draws, their breath rising in white clouds that vanished the moment they formed. She had been traveling for 2 days. 2 days of bad roads and worse food of sleeping upright in her seat because she couldn't afford the boarding house in Casper where the coach stopped overnight. 2 days of holding that satchel like it contained something precious, because it did. 3 needles, a spool of black thread, her mother's thimble worn smooth on the inside from years of use, and a letter folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft from a woman named Ruth Ashford requesting her services as a seamstress for the winter season. Simple work, the letter had promised. Mending alterations, perhaps a few new dresses. Enough money to send home to her younger sister in Denver. Enough to keep the bank from taking their mother's cottage, the one with the blue door and the garden that hadn't been tended since Mama died. Enough to prove that Jessamine Wren was more than the daughter of a man who drank himself into the ground and left nothing behind but empty bottles and a stack of debts thick as a family Bible. The driver pulled the horses to a stop at the top of a long gravel drive, and Jessamine saw it through the dusty glass. The Ashford estate spread across the valley below like something painted by a man who had never known hunger. The main house stood 3 stories tall, built from golden stone that held the last of the afternoon sun. Wraparound porches gleamed white against the darker land. Barns and stables stretched out behind it in orderly rows, and beyond them cattle dotted the hills in numbers that made Jessamine's stomach tighten. Each one of those animals was worth more than she had earned in the past year combined. Wealth, power, the kind of life she had only glimpsed through shop windows back in Denver, pressing her face to the cold glass like a child looking at somebody else's Christmas. "This is your stop, miss," the driver called down his breath, making clouds in the cold air. Jessamine climbed down carefully, her worn boots sinking into the gravel. She straightened her coat, the one she had patched twice at the elbows, and once across the back, where the wool had gone thin. She tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. She lifted her chin. She had learned early that confidence could hide a great many shortcomings. Even if your dress had been mended 6 times, even if your last real meal was yesterday's bread bought with coins she had counted 3 times to make sure she could afford it. She approached the front entrance and raised her hand to knock. The door swung open before her knuckles touched wood. A butler stood in the doorway, his face arranged in the particular expression of a man who had spent decades deciding who belonged and who did not. Behind him, the entrance hall blazed with light. Crystal chandeliers threw prismatic fire across polished floors. Music and laughter echoed from somewhere deep inside the house, the sound of people who had never once wondered whether they could afford to eat tomorrow. "Deliveries go to the back entrance," the butler said, already moving to close the door. "I'm not making a delivery." Jessamine kept her voice steady. "I'm Jessamine Wren. Mrs. Ashford sent for me. I'm the seamstress." The butler's gaze traveled over her threadbare coat, her scuffed boots, the satchel held together with a strap she had mended herself. He looked at her the way people had been looking at her for her entire life, like she was something to be assessed and found wanting. "Mrs. Ashford is indisposed. The household is hosting an important event this evening. Return tomorrow." "I traveled 2 days to get here." The letter said November 15th. Tomorrow. The door closed with the quiet finality of a verdict. Jessamine stood alone on the porch, her breath coming short and fast. The money for her return ticket was already spent on food she couldn't afford not to eat. She had $4 left to her name, not enough for a hotel room, not enough for anything that mattered. She closed her eyes and steadied herself against the wave of panic rising in her chest. She had survived worse than a closed door. Had survived her father's rages, her mother's slow dying, the landlord's threats, the grocer's pity. She would survive this too. Then she heard a voice bright and commanding, cutting through the evening air like a blade through silk. "Nonsense, Thomas. If Mrs. Ashford sent for her, then she's expected. Let the poor girl in before she freezes to death on my porch." The door opened again. A woman in her 60s stood there dressed in deep purple silk, her silver hair swept into an elegant twist. Her eyes were sharp but not cruel, assessing Jessamine with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people the way other women read books. "You must be Miss Wren. I'm Ruth Ashford. Forgive Thomas. He gets overzealous when we have guests." She stepped aside, gesturing inward. "Come in, child, before the cold gets into your bones and sets up permanent residence." Jessamine stepped into warmth that felt like stepping into a dream. The entrance hall was even more magnificent up close. Carved wood paneling rose to the ceiling. Oil paintings hung in gilded frames, portraits of stern-faced men and elegant women who shared a particular darkness in the eyes that seemed to run in the Ashford blood. A grand staircase curved upward, like a ribbon of polished oak, and everywhere, people moved through the space like fish through clear water. Men in tailored suits. Women in gowns that cost more than Jessamine would earn in a year. Champagne glasses catching the chandelier light. Jewels at throats and wrists, diamonds and emeralds and sapphires worn with the casual ease of people who had never pawned anything in their lives. The air hummed with wealth, with comfort, with the particular confidence that came from never having to count coins or mend a coat or wonder whether the bank would come for your home while you slept. Jessamine felt every eye that turned toward her, felt the weight of their assessment like hands pressing on her shoulders. The shabby coat, the patched dress beneath it, the dust on her boots from 2 days of hard travel. She did not look down. She had promised herself long ago that she would never look down. "I apologize for the chaos," Ruth Ashford said, guiding her toward a quieter corner with a gentle hand at her elbow. "My son's engagement celebration began an hour ago. I didn't realize you'd be arriving today, or I would have made proper arrangements." Engagement. Jessamine's stomach sank. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to intrude." "The letter said November 15th, Ruth said with a dry smile that suggested she found the universe's timing personally offensive. "And today is November 15th. I'm the one who should apologize. I've been managing 2 households, planning this disaster of a party, and apparently losing track of my own correspondence." She squeezed Jessamine's arm with surprising warmth. "But you're here now, and I won't send you back into that wind. Come, there's a room prepared for you upstairs. You can rest, have supper sent up, and we'll discuss your work in the morning." The relief hit Jessamine so hard her knees nearly buckled. She locked them straight and kept her expression composed because she had learned that showing weakness in a house full of strangers was like bleeding in water full of sharks. "Thank you. Truly." Ruth led her toward the grand staircase, but they had only climbed 3 steps when a man's voice boomed across the hall with the particular volume of someone accustomed to being heard. "Ruth, there you are. We've been looking everywhere." A portly man in an expensive suit strode toward them, his face flushed with champagne and self-importance. Senator Harlan Drake, though Jessamine didn't know his name yet. Behind him trailed a woman dripping in diamonds and a younger couple who looked vaguely bored by everything, including each other. "Senator Drake," Ruth said with the kind of politeness that took years of practice to perfect. "I was just—" "We need Garrett," Drake interrupted, as if Ruth hadn't been speaking at all. "He's disappeared again, and the Kincaids want to make the formal announcement. Can't have an engagement party without the groom now, can we?" Ruth's expression tightened, a small movement that someone less observant than Jessamine might have missed entirely. "I'm sure he's just stepped out for air. You know how my son feels about crowds." "Well, he'd better feel differently soon." Drake's laugh held no humor, only the sound of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "This union is important. For both families, for the territory's future." His gaze slid to Jessamine, dismissed her in an instant the way you might dismiss a piece of furniture that didn't match the room. "Who's this, a guest?" Ruth said firmly. "Doesn't look like any guest I've ever seen." Drake's eyes traveled over Jessamine's worn clothing with open contempt, the particular cruelty of a man who measured human worth by the price of what they wore. Although I suppose Garrett always did have eclectic taste. The insult landed like a slap across cold skin. Jessamine felt heat flood her cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral, kept her chin exactly where it was. She had endured worse than a drunk man's contempt. Her father had taught her that much, at least. How to stand still while someone tried to make you feel small. "If you'll excuse us," Ruth said here, her voice dropping to a temperature that matched the Wyoming night. I was showing Miss Wren to her room, but Drake had already lost interest, turning back toward the party with his entourage in tow. Find your son, Ruth, before Walter Kincaid loses his patience entirely. Ruth waited until they were out of earshot before releasing a long, controlled breath. That man is insufferable, she murmured, then louder, with a warmth that felt like a shield against the cold Drake had left behind. Come, my dear, let's get you settled before anyone else decides to be rude. The room on the second floor made Jessamine's throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. A four-poster bed with a quilted coverlet, a washstand with an actual mirror, not the cracked fragment she used back in Denver. A window overlooking the valley where the last light of day was painting the hills in shades of amber and rose, the kind of colors that made you believe just for a moment that beauty existed for its own sake, and not just for people who could afford to buy it. It's beautiful, she whispered. I'll have supper brought up. Rest tonight. Ruth paused at the door and her expression changed, softened into something that looked almost like recognition. And Miss Wren, don't let men like Drake make you feel small. You're worth 10 of them, fancy coat or not. The door closed softly. Jessamine set down her satchel, ran her fingers over the smooth coverlet, and allowed herself one moment of weakness. Just one. She sat on the edge of that beautiful bed, in that beautiful room, and let the tears come. Tears of relief, of exhaustion, of the bone-deep terror that had been her constant companion for months, finally loosening its grip just enough for her to breathe. She was safe. For tonight at least she was safe. This knock came an hour later after she had washed her face and changed into her only other dress. Dark blue cotton, carefully mended, but clean. She opened the door expecting a maid with supper. Instead, she found Delia Drake, the senator's daughter, standing in the hallway in a sage green gown with her blonde hair artfully curled and her smile arranged like a weapon. So you're the seamstress. Delia looked Jessamine up and down with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been ranking other women since childhood. I'm Delia Drake, the senator's daughter. She didn't wait for an invitation, swept into the room with the ease of someone who had never been denied an entrance to anything. Told Jessamine that supper would be delayed, that the kitchen was overwhelmed, that she could always come down and join the party if she wanted. It was a test. Jessamine recognized it immediately. The same kind of test she had faced 100 times growing up poor in Denver. Rich girls wanting to see if the poor girl would stumble, would embarrass herself, would provide entertainment for people who had everything except compassion. Jessamine declined politely. Delia pressed, then dropped her real purpose like a stone into still water. There's talk downstairs about Mrs. Ashford bringing in a strange woman during her son's engagement party. Some people are saying it's disrespectful to the Kincaid family. She paused at the door, her smile all sweetness and venom. Just thought you'd want to know what people are thinking. She left before Jessamine could respond. The silence she left behind was worse than the words. Jessamine closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering. She should have known, should have realized that arriving tonight looking the way she did would make her a target. Rich people always needed someone to whisper about, someone to stand below them so they could feel how high they were standing. She moved to the window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Below, guests spilled onto the back terrace, their laughter carrying on the night air. Lanterns hung from tree branches, casting dancing shadows across gardens that someone was paid very well to maintain. A string quartet played somewhere, the music delicate and perfect and completely indifferent to the woman watching from above. That was when she saw him. A man standing alone at the far edge of the terrace, half hidden in shadow. Tall, broad-shouldered, his posture rigid with the particular tension of someone enduring something rather than enjoying it. Even from 2 stories up, Jessamine could feel his isolation. He stood apart from the golden light and easy laughter, like a man standing on the wrong side of a window, looking in at a life that belonged to someone else. A woman in an elaborate pink gown approached him, reaching for his arm. He stepped back. She persisted, her gestures growing animated. Finally, he turned and walked away from the party, entirely disappearing into the darkness beyond the lantern light, with the deliberate stride of a man who knew exactly where he was going, which was anywhere that wasn't here. Jessamine wondered if that was Garrett Ashford, the groom who kept vanishing from his own celebration. Sleep wouldn't come. She lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the party continue below and tried not to think about tomorrow. Near midnight, her stomach growling loud enough to echo in the quiet room, Jessamine gave up on sleep. She lit the bedside lamp and decided to venture downstairs. Not to the party, never that, but to the kitchen where she might find some bread or cheese without bothering anyone. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and slipped into the hallway. The house had quieted somewhat, though she could still hear music and conversation drifting up from below. She found a servant's staircase and descended carefully, following the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread. The kitchen was warm and bright empty, except for a young woman washing dishes at a large stone sink. She looked up as Jessamine entered, her expression wary at first, then softening when she took in the plain dress in uncertain posture. "I'm sorry to intrude," Jessamine said quickly. "I'm staying upstairs and I missed supper. I thought I might find something small. I don't want to be any trouble." "You're the seamstress, aren't you, Miss Wren?" At Jessamine's nod, the young woman smiled warmly. "I'm Tilda. Mrs. Ashford told us to take care of you." She dried her hands on her apron and began pulling food from the larder with the efficient movements of someone who had been feeding people her whole life. Cold chicken, fresh bread still warm from the oven, butter so yellow it looked like captured sunlight, a wedge of cheese and a glass of milk that made Jessamine's mouth water before it even reached the table. "Thank you," Jessamine said, meaning it with an intensity that surprised her. "You didn't have to eat," Tilda said firmly. "You look half-starved, if you'll pardon my saying so." Jessamine took a bite of bread, and it was so good she nearly closed her eyes. Real butter. Fresh baked. When had she last eaten anything that wasn't 3 days old and bought at a discount because the baker was about to throw it away? "I met Miss Drake," Jessamine said between bites, trying to keep her tone casual. "She seemed concerned about my presence here." Tilda snorted a sound that conveyed a lifetime of opinions she was too professional to voice directly. "Delia Drake is concerned about anything that might threaten her position. She's had her eye on Mr. Garrett for years, but he never gave her the time of day. Not once." She lowered her voice, glancing toward the doorway with the habitual caution of someone who knew that servants who gossiped too loudly became former servants. "Truth is, nobody expected this engagement to Miss Kincaid either. It came out of nowhere about 6 weeks ago. Rumor is it's all political. Her father and Senator Drake have business interests together, and they want the Ashford land and influence tied to their railroad plans. Jessamine shouldn't ask. It wasn't her business. Wasn't her world. Wasn't her concern what happened in this house beyond the mending and alterations she had been hired to do. But curiosity won the way it always did. And Mr. Ashford, what does he want?" Tilda's expression turned somber in a way that made her look older than her years. "That's the question, isn't it? He's a good man, Miss Wren. Fair to his workers, honest in his dealings, pays on time, and doesn't cheat anyone, which is more than you can say for most men with his kind of money." She shook her head slowly. "But he's private, keeps his feelings locked up tight like a strongbox nobody has the combination to. All I know is he hasn't smiled once since the engagement was announced. Not once, and tonight at his own party he looks like a man walking to the gallows." The image of that solitary figure on the terrace burned in Jessamine's mind as she thanked Tilda, helped wash her dishes despite protests, and made her way back toward the servants' staircase. But she paused when she heard voices. Raised voices, raw and unguarded, echoing from a room nearby. "I absolutely insist, Garrett. You've been hiding all evening." "I haven't been hiding, Mother. I've been trying to breathe." Jessamine froze. She knew she shouldn't listen. Should climb the stairs and mind her own business and stay far away from the private agonies of people who could afford to have their hearts broken in golden rooms. But something in the man's voice held her there on that staircase. The exhaustion beneath the words. The sound of someone who had been carrying something heavy for so long that his arms had gone numb, but he couldn't remember how to set it down. Ruth's voice came through the wall, strained with love and frustration in equal measure. "This is important. The Kincaids expect certain courtesies. Penelope has been looking for you. Penelope doesn't want to find me any more than I want to be found." Footsteps pacing across hardwood. The sound of a man moving through a cage. "This entire arrangement is a farce, and you know it. What I know is that you agreed to this engagement. I agreed to protect the ranch from Drake's political maneuvering. That doesn't mean I have to pretend to be happy about it." A silence followed, long and heavy as the Wyoming sky before a storm. When Ruth spoke again, her voice had changed, gone gentle, in a way that made Jessamine's chest ache with recognition. Garrett, son, I know this isn't what you wanted, but sometimes we have to do what's necessary. His laugh held nothing that resembled humor. I'm aware I've been doing what's necessary my entire life. Tonight is just another performance. If you just give Penelope a chance. I've given her every chance. She's a perfectly pleasant woman who deserves someone who can actually love her. That person isn't me. His voice dropped lower, rough with something old and deep and unhealed. I won't do that to another woman, mother. I won't pretend I can give what I don't have anymore. Jessamine turned and climbed the stairs silently, her heart aching for a man she had never met. She recognized that voice. The same sound she heard in her own throat after her father died, after the debts came due, after she understood that wanting a different life didn't make one appear. The art of enduring, of putting one foot in front of the other when you couldn't see the road ahead. She knew that art well, had been practicing it for years. She should have gone to bed, should have locked her door and pulled the covers over her head and stayed far away from the drama unfolding in this house. But Jessamine Wren had always been too curious for her own survival. She found an alcove off the main hall, half hidden behind a potted fern, where she could watch the ballroom without being seen. The room stretched before her, all golden light and swirling gowns, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic rainbows across polished floors. At the center stood Penelope Kincaid, pretty, in a porcelain way, her practiced smile never quite reaching her eyes. She held court among a circle of guests, laughing at something someone said, but the laughter was hollow, performed like a song sung by someone who had memorized the notes but never felt the music. And beside her, his hand trapped beneath hers on his arm, stood the man from the terrace, Garrett Ashford. Up close, even from across the room, he was striking. Not handsome in any easy way. His features were too hard for that jaw, too angular. Dark eyes too shadowed the face of a man who had been weathered by more than just Wyoming wind, but compelling in the way that mountains were compelling. You couldn't look away, even when you knew you should. He stood a head taller than most men in the room. His black suit fit perfectly across broad shoulders, and his dark hair was neatly combed but looked like it wanted to be wild like the rest of him. When Penelope reached up to adjust his collar, an intimate gesture meant to show the room she owned him, Jessamine saw his jaw clench, saw him resist the instinct to step back, saw what it cost him to hold still. Poor bastard, looks like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Jessamine jumped. A man had appeared beside her alcove, younger than Garrett, maybe 25, lounging against the wall with an easy smile and eyes sharp enough to cut. I didn't mean to spy, Jessamine said quickly. Neither did I. But here we both are, hiding in the shadows while Rome burns. He extended his hand. Eli Ashford, the disappointing younger brother. Jessamine Wren. She shook his hand, noting calluses that said this wasn't just a rich man's son playing at ranch work. The mysterious seamstress, Eli said with a grin. Delia Drake has been speculating about you for the past hour. According to her latest theory, you're either a long-lost relative, a former lover, or a spy from a rival ranching operation. Despite everything, Jessamine smiled. I'm none of those things, just someone who needs work. Then you've definitely come to the wrong party. Eli's gaze drifted back to the ballroom, and his grin faded into something more complicated. This whole thing is a disaster waiting to happen. My brother looks ready to bolt. Penelope looks like she's performing for an audience of judges. And Senator Drake is about 3 drinks away from starting a political incident. Why did he agree to it? Jessamine asked. Your brother, if he's this unhappy. Eli's expression sobered in a way that made him look suddenly older, as if someone had lifted a mask and shown her the man underneath the easy charm. Because my brother has spent his entire life doing what he thinks is right instead of what he wants. Our father built this ranch from nothing, came out here with empty pockets and a mule, and turned bare land into an empire through nothing but sweat and stubbornness. When he died, Garrett took on everything. The land, the debts, the responsibility for every single person who works here and their families. He paused, watching his brother across the room with something between admiration and grief. Drake has been pushing for years to get control of our water rights and grazing land for his railroad interests. An alliance with the Kincaid family gives Garrett political protection. He shook his head slowly. But the cost is his life, his freedom, any chance at actual happiness. Jessamine felt the familiar tightness in her chest. The understanding that came from living the same truth in different clothes. Sometimes survival doesn't leave room for happiness. No, Eli agreed quietly, but that doesn't mean we stop wanting it. They stood together in the shadows watching the performance unfold. Then Jessamine saw a man weaving through the crowd. Older, red-faced, already well past drunk. He was heading straight for the center of the room, and the expression on his face promised nothing good. "Who's that?" she asked. Eli cursed under his breath. "Walter Kincaid, Penelope's father, and he's absolutely loaded." What happened next happened fast. Walter Kincaid grabbed Garrett's arm, hauled him forward, pressed his hand over Penelope's in front of everyone, made a speech about alliances and prosperity and futures joined together, his words slurring at the edges, but his meaning clear enough. This was a transaction, a business deal sealed with human beings instead of signatures. The crowd applauded uncertainly. Penelope's smile looked like it might crack if she held it any tighter. And Garrett stood there like a man watching the prison door close from the inside. Senator Drake raised his champagne glass to toast the happy couple. He never finished the sentence, because that was when a man named Briggs, one of Drake's business associates, drunk and mean and looking for entertainment, spotted Jessamine in her alcove and decided she was it. He grabbed her arm and yanked her into the ballroom before she could react. His grip was bruising, his breath was sour with whiskey, and his voice carried across the silent room like a gunshot. "There she is, the little seamstress. Been watching you all night, pretty thing. Thought you could hide, but I found you." Every eye in the room turned to Jessamine. She felt the judgment land like physical weight. The shabby coat, the mended dress, the dust still on her boots. She could hear the whispers starting, the assumptions forming, the story being written about her in real time by people who didn't know her name and didn't care to learn it. "Let me go," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the terror climbing her throat. "Not yet," Briggs leered, pulling her closer. "Haven't had my dance." "I believe the lady asked you to let her go." The voice cut through the ballroom like a blade drawn from a sheath. Cold, commanding, absolutely unyielding. Garrett Ashford stood 10 feet away. His expression was carved from stone, but his eyes burned with something dangerous. Something that made Briggs release Jessamine's arm and stumble backward like a man who had just realized the thing he'd been poking with a stick was not in fact dead. "Now, Garrett, don't get all righteous. We're just having a bit of fun." "Let her go." The room had gone completely silent. Even the musicians had stopped. Jessamine stood in the center of 100 staring faces, her arm throbbing where Briggs had held it, her heart slamming against her ribs. Garrett moved forward, not fast, slow and deliberate, with the fluid control of a man who knew exactly how much damage he could do and was deciding how much to hold back. "You will apologize to the lady, and then you will leave my home." "Lady," Briggs sneered, the whiskey making him brave and stupid in equal measure. "Come on, Garrett. We all know what she is." "Seamstress," he snorted. "Is that what you're calling them now?" The insult hung in the air like smoke. Garrett's hands clenched into fists, his jaw locked. For one breathless moment, Jessamine thought he would hit the man, and part of her wished he would. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He turned to her. His dark eyes met hers with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. And then he smiled. A slight, deliberate curve of his mouth that didn't reach his eyes, but changed the temperature of the entire room. "Gentlemen," he said softly, never breaking eye contact with Jessamine, "let me clarify any confusion." He reached for her hand, and Jessamine, too stunned to resist, let him take it. His palm was warm, calloused, steady. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. A gesture so intimate, so deliberate, that gasps rippled through the crowd like stones dropped in still water. Then Garrett Ashford turned to face the ballroom, still holding her hand, and spoke 5 words that would change both their lives forever. "Gentlemen, meet my wife." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Jessamine had ever heard. Penelope Kincaid made a sound like something breaking. Walter Kincaid went the color of a bruise. Senator Drake's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, spraying crystal across the polished wood. And Ruth Ashford, standing near the doorway, pressed her hand over her mouth to hide what might have been shock, or might have been the beginning of a smile. Garrett's grip on Jessamine's hand tightened, not painfully but firmly, an anchor in the storm he had just unleashed. "What?" Walter Kincaid sputtered. What are you talking about? You're engaged to my daughter. A mistake. One I'm correcting now. Garrett's voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a man who had just burned every bridge behind him and was walking forward because there was nowhere else to go. He glanced at Penelope, and for the first time that evening, his expression softened with something that might have been genuine regret. Miss Kincaid, I apologize. This was wrong of me, all of it, but I can't marry you when I'm already married to someone else. When? Drake demanded, his face darkening with fury. This is insane. When did this alleged marriage take place? 3 months ago, Garrett said without hesitation. Privately in Denver. He looked down at Jessamine again, and she saw the silent plea in his eyes, clear as words on a page. Play along, just for now. And Jessamine, who had nothing to lose and everything to gain, who understood desperation and the mathematics of survival better than she understood anything else in the world, made a choice. She squeezed his hand back. I'm sorry, she said softly, addressing the room but speaking to the man beside her. We didn't mean to deceive anyone. We wanted to wait to tell his family properly, but she let her voice trail off, let them fill in the blanks with whatever story they needed to believe. This is a lie, Walter Kincaid snarled, a desperate, transparent lie to get out of the engagement. Then prove it, Garrett challenged. Right to the courthouse in Denver. Check the records, you'll find them. It was a bluff. It had to be a bluff. But he delivered it with such absolute conviction that doubt flickered across Walter's face like lamplight in wind. The room erupted. Drake and Kincaid shouting over each other. Penelope standing pale and frozen, her porcelain composure finally cracking. Guests whispering with the hungry delight of people witnessing someone else's catastrophe. But Garrett ignored them all. He walked toward the door, pulling Jessamine gently beside him, and they climbed the main staircase together while the chaos raged below. On the second-floor landing, he stopped, released her hand. The mask fell away, and she saw the man beneath it, exhausted, afraid, running on nothing but adrenaline and the desperate hope that she wouldn't scream at him for what he had just done. I'm sorry, Tso, he said, his voice rough as a gravel road. I had no right to pull you into that. You saved me from that man, from his assumptions about who I am. I made different assumptions, different but just as presumptuous. He ran a hand through his hair, disturbing its neat arrangement. The truth is, I panicked. I saw a way out of that engagement, out of Drake's control, and I took it without thinking about what it would cost you. What will it cost me? He looked at her then, really looked at her, not at her worn dress or her patched coat or the dust on her boots, at her. Everything, or nothing, depends on what happens next. Then he laid it out, the offer, the arrangement, the contract, 1 year pretending to be his wife. In return, he would clear every debt her family owed, set her up with her own seamstress shop in Denver, give her enough money to change everything. All she had to do was lie, convincingly, consistently, for 12 months. And there was one final rule, the most important clause written into the agreement like a load-bearing wall: no romantic feelings, no expectations beyond the deal. This was business. When it ended, they would walk away as strangers who had done each other a favor. Nothing more. Why is that rule so important to you? Jessamine asked. Because feelings complicate things. Because people get hurt when expectations don't align with reality. His voice dropped and something old and wounded surfaced behind his eyes. Because I won't survive having someone else look at me the way Lorraine did, like I was a disappointment they had to endure. And you think I'd do that? I think anyone would, given enough time and proximity. His expression hardened back into business. So we don't give it time. We maintain boundaries. Keep this professional. Survive the year and part as friends if we're lucky. Jessamine thought of her sister alone in that cold cottage. Thought of the bank notice with its red stamp and its deadline racing toward them like a train. Thought of every year she had spent surviving, just surviving, never quite living. She named her price. Everything he offered, plus her sister's security, plus one condition of her own. When this is over, you don't get to judge how I live my life. You don't check on me. You don't have opinions about my choices. We walk away clean. No strings, no guilt. Agreed. He held out his hand. She looked at it, calloused and strong, offering salvation dressed up as deception. She took it. He pulled a small box from his desk drawer. Inside a simple gold band, etched with tiny flowers worn smooth by decades of wear. His grandmother's ring. Ruth had said he should give Jessamine something real to wear. "It's just a prop," he said, but his voice had gone quiet in a way that contradicted the words. He slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, settling against her skin like it had been waiting for her. His fingers lingered one moment longer than necessary before he pulled away. "There," he said, all business again. "Now you look like a wife." Below them, the party was ending. Guests were leaving, carrying with them the most scandalous gossip Wyoming had seen in years. And somewhere between the second-floor landing and the silence that followed, a lie had taken root. Neither of them knew yet what it would grow into. But Ruth Ashford, watching from the shadows below, murmured to herself, "That ring has only ever been worn by women who loved the men they married. Remember that." The bargain was struck. Now came the hard part, living with it. The morning sun hadn't yet crested the mountains when Jessamine woke to find a cream-colored envelope slipped under her door. Inside, written in precise masculine handwriting, was a single line, "My study, 7 a.m. We need to make this official." She dressed carefully in her better dress, the blue cotton that had seen her through job interviews and church services, and every moment in her life that required looking more capable than she felt. She found her way downstairs. The house was eerily quiet after last night's chaos, the grand rooms stripped of their party finery, revealing elegant bones beneath. Garrett's study was tucked at the back of the house facing the eastern hills. She knocked twice before his voice called her in. He stood behind a massive oak desk covered in papers, dressed in work clothes now. Dark trousers, a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of actual labor. His hair was damp, as if he'd recently bathed, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he'd slept as poorly as she had. "Coffee," he gestured to a pot on the sideboard. "Please." Jessamine poured herself a cup with hands that wanted to shake, forcing them steady. The coffee was strong and bitter, grounding her in this impossible reality. Garrett remained standing, studying the papers before him with the focus of a general planning a campaign. "I've been working since 4, he said without preamble, "trying to anticipate every angle Drake and Kincaid will use to disprove our marriage." He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers with uncomfortable directness. "They'll investigate everything. Your background, your family, where you've been the past few months. They'll look for inconsistencies." "Then we'd better get our story straight," Jessamine said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "Exactly." For the next 2 hours, they built their lie brick by careful brick. They had met in Denver 4 months ago, Garrett decided, when he'd come to the city on cattle business. Jessamine had been working in a dress shop, true enough that she could provide real details if pressed. They'd been drawn to each other despite their different circumstances. He'd courted her quietly, not wanting his mother to interfere or Drake to use the connection politically. "We married in a small ceremony," Garrett said, making notes in that precise handwriting. "Just us and 2 witnesses we paid for their discretion. No family, no announcement. We intended to tell everyone after the busy season, but then Drake pushed the engagement to Penelope, and I panicked. Made the wrong choice. Agreed to something I had no right to agree to." "Why didn't you tell him about me then?" Jessamine asked, following the logic of the fiction they were creating. "Fear," Garrett said simply. "Fear he'd find a way to use you against me." He paused. "That's actually true. Drake would do exactly that." It was a good story, clean, simple, with enough truth woven through the fiction that Jessamine could tell it without her voice catching on the lies. She had been working in a dress shop. She had been in Denver. The details were real, even if the story wasn't, and Jessamine had learned long ago that the best lies were the ones built on true foundations. Garrett had already sent his ranch foreman into Denver with instructions to create a paper trail. Backdated documents filed at the courthouse. Bribe clerks if necessary. It was risky and probably illegal, but he approached it with the same grim efficiency he seemed to bring to every impossible task. Like a man who had stopped believing things would work out and had simply started working until they did. "There's one more thing," he said, finally pushing a sheath of papers across the desk. "Our actual contract. The real agreement between us. The one no one else will ever see." Jessamine read through it carefully. The terms were generous, more than generous. $5,000 upon signing, paid directly to clear her family's debts. Another $5,000 at the end of 12 months. The deed to a shop property in Denver transferred to her name regardless of whether she completed the full term. Room and board at the ranch for the duration. A clothing allowance so she could dress the part of a rancher's wife. She signed her name at the bottom, Jessamine Wren, soon to be Jessamine Ashford, at least on paper. At least for now. Senator Harlan Drake arrived at 10 minutes past noon, which told Jessamine everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was. Not the kind who waited, not the kind who sent letters or requested meetings through proper channels, the kind who showed up at your door with a lawyer and the absolute certainty that he would leave with what he came for. Ruth entered without waiting, her expression tight. Drake's carriage just came up the drive. He's brought a lawyer. Garrett looked at Jessamine across the desk. She saw the question in his eyes. Not whether the story would hold, but whether she would. Whether the seamstress from Denver could stand in front of a United States senator in his hired legal mind and lie without blinking. She stood, smoothed her skirt, lifted her chin the way she always did when the world was trying to push her down. "Where do you want me?" Something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of respect. "By my side," he said, "where a wife belongs." They faced Drake in the formal parlor, a room that smelled of beeswax and leather-bound books and the particular weight of money that had been accumulating for generations. Drake paced like something caged. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Blackwood, sat at the table with a leather case full of documents and the patient expression of someone who was paid by the hour and intended to earn every cent. "This is a farce," Drake said, without sitting, without greeting, without any of the social courtesies he probably demanded from everyone else. A desperate lie from a desperate man. "Investigate all you want," Garrett said. His hand rested at the small of Jessamine's back, light enough to seem casual, firm enough that she could feel his pulse through his fingertips. He was terrified. She was the only person in the room who knew it. "You'll find marriage papers filed in Denver on July 23rd. You'll find the clerk who processed them. You'll find the witnesses." "Forged," Drake spat. "All of it. Prove it." Blackwood began his methodical dissection. Dates, locations, the witnesses' names, how long the courtship lasted, where they had dinner on their wedding night. The questions came fast and precise, designed to find the gaps in a story that had only been built that morning. Jessamine answered them. Not Garrett, Jessamine. She stepped forward, drawing Drake's attention away from the man beside her, and she answered every question with the steady calm of someone telling the truth. Because in her mind, she wasn't lying. She was sewing, stitching together pieces of fabric that didn't naturally belong together and making them hold. It was what she had done her entire life, taking scraps and making something whole. She described the dress shop in Denver where she had worked, real place, real details. She described the day Garrett had walked in needing a button replaced on his coat and how his hands had been too large for the delicate chairs in the waiting area. She described their first dinner at a restaurant she had actually eaten at once when a customer had tipped her enough to afford a meal that wasn't bread and cheese. She described falling in love with a man who didn't know how to talk about his feelings, but showed them in every small action, who held doors and remembered details and looked at her like she was the first real thing he had seen in years. That last part wasn't a lie, she just didn't know it yet. Drake watched her with narrowing eyes. She could feel him searching for cracks for the moment her voice would waver or her gaze would shift. He didn't find it, because Jessamine Wren had spent 26 years lying to people who thought they were better than her, and she had never once been caught. "Senator Drake," she said when the questions finally paused, her voice level as a carpenter's or mine. "I understand your anger. This news was unexpected, and the timing was unfortunate. But I promise you our marriage is real. Garrett and I wanted to wait to announce it properly. We never meant to hurt anyone." "You expect me to believe," Drake said slowly, "that Garrett Ashford married a penniless seamstress in secret. What did he promise you? What did you demand as payment for this performance?" The insult was calculated, meant to shake her, to remind her of her place. Jessamine met his eyes without flinching. "He promised me nothing except himself, which is more than some people get in a lifetime of proper marriages." Something shifted in the room. Drake looked at her with new assessment, And she could see the moment he realized she was not the easy target he had expected. She was not going to crumble, was not going to contradict herself or burst into tears or look to Garrett for rescue. Drake left with threats. Blackwood left with his documents. The door closed behind them, and Garrett's hand dropped from Jessamyn's back as if the contact had been burning him. "That went well," he said. The humor in his voice was dark enough to match his eyes. "He'll investigate everything, and he'll find what we planted." Garrett moved to the window, putting distance between them. "But he's right about the political consequences. Without the Kincaid connection, I've lost allies. Other ranchers will see this as weakness, as emotional instability. They'll test me." Ruth entered with tea and instructions that brooked no argument. They would attend the church social on Sunday. They would be seen together. Be seen? They would convince every suspicious eye in the territory that this marriage was as real as the ground beneath their feet. "And you," she said, pointing at her son with the authority of a woman who had raised him and was not above reminding him of it, "need to stop looking at Jessamyn like she's a balance sheet and start looking at her like a man in love." "I'm not an actor," Garrett said. "Then learn. Because if you can't convince people that this marriage is real, you'll lose everything. The ranch, your reputation, your freedom from Drake's schemes. Is your pride worth that much?" The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that should have been comfortable and would have been if comfort weren't the most dangerous thing in the world for two people pretending not to feel what they were feeling. They spent the afternoon playing the roles they'd written for themselves. Garrett showed her the cattle operation, the breeding program his father had started, and he'd expanded the irrigation system that made the land profitable. He introduced her to workers who tipped their hats and looked curious to ranch hands, who seemed to know their boss well enough to see his tension, but were too polite to comment. And they rode. Jessamyn seated in front of Garrett on his black gelding because she didn't know how to ride, and the closeness looked romantic to anyone watching from a distance. His arm bracketed her to hold the reins, his chest solid against her back, and she learned the geography of the ranch while trying to ignore the geography of the man behind her. "You're good at this," she said as they crested a hill overlooking miles of grazing land. "At riding, at running a ranch, at taking care of people who depend on you." She glanced back at him. "Why did you think you were cold?" His arms tightened slightly around her. "Because I don't feel things the way I should. Don't connect with people easily. Lorraine was right about that. I'm better with cattle and land than with humans." "I think you connect just fine," Jessamyn said. "You just don't trust it anymore." He didn't answer, but she felt the way his breathing changed, felt the moment when he pulled back emotionally even though he couldn't pull back physically without dropping her from the horse. Jessamyn noticed things about him now. The way he took his coffee black, strong enough to strip paint. How he rubbed the back of his neck when he was frustrated with paperwork. The small smile that touched his lips when one of the ranch hands told a particularly terrible joke. A smile he tried to suppress and couldn't quite manage. The careful way he handled everything. Animals equipment people, as if he'd learned early that carelessness led to disaster. She noticed, too, that he read poetry. Found him one evening in the library with a volume of Whitman open on his knee, his lips moving slightly with the words, and when he realized she was watching, he closed the book so fast you would have thought she had caught him with something shameful. "You don't have to hide that," she said. "I'm not hiding anything. You read poetry in secret like it's a crime. In Wyoming, it might as well be." She laughed, and he stared at her as if the sound had physically struck him, as if he hadn't heard genuine laughter in his house in a very long time. They attended the church social on Sunday. Half the territory came to see the spectacle. Jessamyn wore a new dress, pale green cotton, that Ruth had somehow produced in 3 days fitted perfectly to her figure. Pearl combs in her hair, the gold band gleaming on her finger. She looked like she belonged, felt like an imposter wearing someone else's life. But she played the part. Answered questions from sharp-eyed women who wanted to find cracks. Smiled at men who assessed her like livestock. Stood beside Garrett with her hand in his while he told their story to anyone who asked, and she watched the community's suspicion slowly, grudgingly give way to something like acceptance. Walter Kincaid confronted them at the edge of the church grounds. Cold, disdainful, his expensive clothes worn like armor. Called their marriage an impulse and predicted its failure with the confidence of a man who had already decided to help make it fail. Jessamyn stepped forward before Garrett could respond. Mr. Kincaid, I'm sorry for any pain this situation has caused your daughter. Truly. But I won't apologize for marrying the man I love, even if the circumstances weren't what everyone expected. She reached for Garrett's hand, lacing her fingers through his. My husband cleared my family's debts because that's the kind of man he is. One who protects the people he cares about, even when it costs him something. Truth wrapped in lies. It landed with perfect weight because the best fabrications were the ones you almost believed yourself. The dance lessons began that week. Ruth insisted. The Henderson Harvest Dance was coming, and Garrett and Jessamine needed to waltz like people who had done it before. Like people who knew each other's bodies the way long married couples did, without thinking, without counting steps, without the careful distance of strangers sharing space. They practiced in the library every evening after dinner. Ruth played piano the first few nights, then conveniently developed headaches that required early retirement, leaving them alone with the firelight and the music Garrett hummed when there was no piano to guide them. He was patient, adjusted his movements to match her stumbling attempts, held her steady when she faltered, guided her through patterns with hands that were firm without being forceful. You're thinking too much, he said after she stepped on his feet for the third time. Stop counting, just follow me. Trust me to lead. Trust, such a small word for such an enormous thing. But Jessamine closed her eyes, let herself sink into the rhythm of his humming, the pressure of his hand at her waist, the warmth of him, and slowly and possibly they began to move together. Not perfectly, but together. Her feet found the pattern. Her body learned to anticipate the way he turned, the way he guided, the way he held her, like something that might break if he wasn't careful. With each evening, the distance between them shrank. Her hand drifted from his shoulder to the back of his neck. His fingers spread wider at her waist. They stopped talking during the dances. Let the movement speak instead. And Jessamine found herself living for those stolen moments, when touching him was required, when closeness was expected, when she could pretend the accelerated beating of her heart was just exertion. One night, late rain hammering the windows and thunder rolling across the plains, like a warning, Garrett told her about Lorraine. They were sitting in the library afterward, the fire burning low, 2 glasses of whiskey between them that neither was really drinking. He said her name the way you'd say the name of a wound that never fully healed. We were engaged 6 years ago. Beautiful, intelligent, from a good family. His voice was carefully flat, stripped of everything that might reveal how much the words still cost him. I thought she loved me. Loved this land. We planned everything. The wedding, the future, children we'd raise here. He stared into the fire and the flames reflected in his dark eyes like memories burning. 3 weeks before the ceremony, I found her in the barn with my father's business partner. She told me she could never love someone as rigid and cold as me, that she'd only agreed to the engagement for my money and status. She'd been having the affair for months. The words fell into the quiet room like stones into deep water. She was wrong, Jessamine said. She wasn't. He looked at her, and the emptiness in his eyes was worse than anger, worse than grief. It was the look of a man who had examined the accusation from every angle and concluded it was accurate. I am rigid. I am cold. I've spent 6 years proving her right, building walls so high nothing gets in. You're not cold, Jessamine said. You're careful. There's a difference. Is there? A cold man doesn't remember every worker's child by name, doesn't read Whitman in secret, doesn't teach a woman to dance with that kind of patience. She set down her whiskey glass with deliberate care. Lorraine was wrong. And so was she cruel. You've spent 6 years building a prison out of her words and locking yourself inside it. He stared at her with something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Then he looked away, back to the fire, and the shutters came down. We should get some sleep. The Henderson dance is Saturday. He left her sitting alone with 2 untouched glasses of whiskey and the growing certainty that Lorraine's cruelty hadn't just broken Garrett Ashford's heart. It had convinced him at the deepest level that his heart wasn't worth having. The night before the Henderson dance, they practiced one last time. Ruth had retired early with one of her convenient headaches. Rain battered the windows again harder now, and thunder cracked close enough to rattle the glass in its frames. They danced in silence, the fire throwing shadows across the walls like an audience of ghosts, and somewhere in the middle of the waltz, something shifted. Some invisible line that had been holding them apart dissolved like sugar in warm water. His hand slid higher on her back, pulled her flush against him. Her fingers tightened in his hair, no longer just following but holding on. Their bodies pressed together from chest to thigh, moving in perfect synchronization, and Jessamine could feel his heart hammering as fast as her own. The humming stopped. They stopped moving, but neither stepped apart. Jessamine, he said, her name rough with warning. I know, she whispered. The contract, the rule. The rule, he agreed, but his hand was still at her waist, and his eyes were dark with something that looked nothing like indifference. She kissed him. It was supposed to be brief, a moment of weakness quickly corrected. But the instant her lips touched his, Garrett made a sound deep in his chest and kissed her back with the desperation of a man who had been refusing himself water while standing at the edge of a river. His hand fisted in the fabric of her dress, her fingers tangled in his hair. The careful distance they had maintained for weeks shattered like a window hit by a stone. Garrett pulled back first, breathing hard, his expression torn between desire and something that looked like panic. We can't, he said roughly. Jessamine, we agreed. She did not step back, did not lower her eyes, did not give him the retreat he was looking for. I'm breaking the agreement, she said. I'm breaking the rule. Don't. It came out like a plea. Don't give me something I can't keep. Who says you can't keep it? I do. He moved backward, putting distance between them with visible effort, and she could see the walls going up in real time, brick by brick, mortared with 6 years of believing he wasn't worth loving. I told you what happened with Lorraine. I'm not capable of this. Whatever you think you feel, don't tell me what I feel. Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him cold. Lorraine was cruel and wrong, and you've spent 6 years proving her right because it was easier than risking your heart again. She moved toward him. He didn't retreat. Couldn't, maybe. His back was almost against the bookshelf. I have feelings for you, Garrett. I've had them for weeks. And I'm not going to pretend I don't, and I'm not going to wait for permission, and I'm not going to let you hide behind a contract we both know stopped meaning anything the first time you held me on that horse, and I felt safe for the first time in years. She touched his face, felt the tension in his jaw, the heat of his skin, the way his breath caught at the contact. You have one chance, she said. Right now, tell me you feel nothing, and I'll walk back to my room and we'll never speak of this again. We'll finish the year and walk away like strangers. She held his gaze. But if you feel something, anything, then have the courage to say it. Because I'm not Lorraine. I don't break. And I don't leave. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. She could hear the rain, the fire, his breathing, her own pulse. I'm terrified, he said finally. The word came out raw, stripped of every defense. I'm terrified of you, of this, of wanting something I don't believe I deserve. That's not nothing. No, his voice broke. That's everything. That's exactly the problem. His hand came up to cover hers where it rested on his face. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the walls were down. Not carefully dismantled, but blown apart, rubble and dust and whatever had been locked behind them, flooding into his expression all at once. I love you, he said. I've been falling since you stood in my ballroom in that worn-out coat and looked Senator Drake in the eye like he was nothing. Maybe before that. Maybe since you squeezed my hand back and chose to play along with a desperate stranger's lie. She kissed him again. He kissed her back and without restraint. And outside, the storm broke open across the Wyoming sky like it had been waiting for this moment for these two damaged, cautious, desperately brave people to finally stop pretending. 3 days followed that felt like borrowed time, like the universe had opened a window and said, here, this is what living feels like. Remember it. 3 days of waking up to his arms around her, of sharing coffee in the morning with genuine smiles instead of careful performance, of dancing in the library, not because they needed practice, but because they wanted to hold each other, of Jessamine telling him about her father's cruelty, her mother's slow death, the years of scraping and struggling, and Garrett listening with an attention that felt like being held, of Garrett telling her about his father's expectations, the weight of the ranch, the loneliness of being the man everyone depended on and no one truly knew. 3 days of living instead of surviving. On the fourth morning, Garrett slammed the newspaper down at breakfast hard enough to rattle every dish on the table. Drake had filed a formal complaint with the territorial court. Fraud charges, demanding investigation of backdated documents, bribed officials the entire conspiracy, asking for the marriage to be nullified, and both Garrett and Jessamine charged with criminal fraud. Can he do that? Jessamine asked, her stomach dropping. He can try, and with the right judge, the right political pressure, he might succeed. Garrett's jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. If this goes to trial, you could face prison, fines you can't pay, your name destroyed throughout the territory. Then we fight it together. The truth makes it worse, Jessamine Brown. The truth is we conspired. We forged documents. We deceived an entire community. His voice went flat in a way she recognized. The walls were going up again. She could practically hear the bricks being laid. The fact that we fell in love afterward doesn't erase what we did before. She watched it happen over the next 2 days. Watched him retreat inch by inch behind the familiar armor. Watched the man who had held her and whispered that he loved her slowly disappear behind the face of a rancher, calculating losses and managing risk. On the 6th day, she found him in the barn after dark, half a bottle of whiskey beside him on the hay bale, eyes hollow as a burned-out house. Drake's lawyer came this afternoon, he said without looking at her. While you were out riding, he made an offer. Cold dread pooled in Jessamine's stomach. What kind of offer? If I agree to annul the marriage, admit the fraud publicly, accept penalties, fines, restrictions on my business dealings, Drake drops all charges against you. Your name is cleared. You walk away with everything I've already paid you. No criminal record. And you, Tom, ruined, reputation destroyed, business crippled for years. Probably lose a significant portion of the ranch to pay the fines. He finally looked at her and his eyes held nothing but resolve. The terrible, self-destructive resolve of a man who had decided to fall on his own sword. But you'd be safe, that's what matters. No. She stood, hands clenched into fists at her sides. Absolutely not. We fight this together. There is no together. His voice was so flat, so empty, it took her breath away. There's you with your whole life ahead of you. And there's me paying for my mistakes. That's how this ends. That's not you protecting me. That's you deciding for me. It's me accepting reality. It's you being a coward. The word hit him like a physical blow. She saw him flinch, kept going anyway because someone had to say it, and she had promised herself she would never be the woman who stayed silent when the truth needed speaking. 3 days ago, you told me you loved me. You kissed me in the rain and promised we'd figure things out together. Was that a lie? It wasn't a lie, it was a mistake. His voice was quiet, devastated, certain. Loving me has put you in danger. The kindest thing I can do is let you go. The kindest thing you can do is trust me to make my own choices about what risks I'm willing to take. Her hands were shaking now, her whole body trembling with emotion too large to contain. But you can't do that, can you? Because trusting me means believing I might actually stay. And you're so convinced you're unlovable that you'll destroy anything good rather than risk finding out you're wrong. He said nothing, stood there with his jaw locked and his fists clenched and his heart slamming behind a wall she could no longer reach. I'm going to leave, Jessamine said. Her voice had gone steady. The shaking had stopped, replaced by a clarity that felt like ice forming over deep water. Not because you're forcing me out, because I'm choosing to go. Choosing to show you what it actually feels like when someone leaves so you understand the difference between that and someone fighting to stay. She rose on her toes and kissed his cheek. Gentle, final. When you're ready to stop being a coward, you know where to find me. But I won't wait forever, Garrett. Eventually, even the people who love you most run out of chances to give. She walked to the barn door, paused, gave him one last opportunity to stop her, to choose her, to be brave enough to fight for something that mattered more than safety. He said nothing. Jessamine left the barn, climbed the stairs to her room, and packed her single bag. She left the beautiful dresses Ruth had given her, left the pearl combs and the silk stockings, and everything that belonged to the life she had been pretending to live. She took only what she had brought: the needles, the thread, her mother's thimble, and the gold ring on her finger, because taking it off felt like something she wasn't ready to do. Ruth found her in the hallway, looked at the bag, understood immediately. He told you. He told me he's giving up. That stubborn, self-destructive boy. Ruth's voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment she looked every one of her 60 years. Then she straightened the way women of her generation had learned to straighten because the world didn't stop for grief. Jessamine hugged the older woman tightly. Thank you for believing I was worth fighting for, even when your son couldn't. He'll realize, Ruth said fiercely. He's stubborn, but he's not stupid. He'll realize what he's lost and come for you. I hope you're right, but I'm done hoping he'll change. He has to want to change, has to want me enough to face his fear. She walked down the grand staircase for the last time, through the entrance hall where everything had begun, out the front door into morning sunlight that felt too bright for the darkness inside her chest. No one followed. No voice called her back. The house stood silent behind her as she walked down the long gravel drive with her worn bag and her straight spine and her breaking heart. She did not look back, because looking back was something you did when you weren't sure. And Jessamine was sure. Sure she loved him. Sure she was right to leave. Sure that if he didn't come for her, she would survive it the way she had survived everything else, by putting one foot in front of the other until the pain became something she could carry instead of something that carried her. Inside his study, Garrett stood at the window and watched her go. Watched her walk away from him with that determined stride and that straight back and that absolute refusal to be destroyed by his cowardice. Part of him wanted to run after her. Part of him was already composing the apology, already imagining the relief on her face, already feeling the weight of her in his arms. But the bigger part, the part that had been wounded so many times it had forgotten what unwounded felt like, that part stayed rooted to the floor. Let her go. Told himself it was the right thing, the noble thing, the only thing. At precisely 8 o'clock, Drake's lawyer arrived. Garrett signed the papers with a steady hand, agreed to terms that would cripple his business for years, accepted the complete destruction of his reputation in exchange for Jessamine's safety. The lawyer left satisfied. Drake had won. And Garrett Ashford sat in his empty study in his empty house with his empty heart and wondered if protecting someone from yourself counted as love when it felt exactly like dying. The ranch felt wrong without her. Garrett noticed it the way you notice a missing tooth, not constantly, but in every moment that mattered. The silence at breakfast where her voice used to be. The empty chair across from him at dinner pushed in tight against the table as if someone had tried to erase the evidence that a person had ever sat there. The library where they had danced, where the air still held some faint memory of her perfume. Or maybe that was just his mind, refusing to let go of something his hands had already released. He told himself it was temporary. Told himself the ache would fade the way all aches faded if you ignored them long enough. He had survived Lorraine. He would survive this. Surviving was the one thing Garrett Ashford had always been good at, even when surviving felt indistinguishable from dying. He was wrong. 3 days after Jessamine left, he caught himself turning to tell her something about the cattle count before remembering she wasn't there. The words formed on his lips and died in the empty air, leaving a silence that felt louder than any sound the ranch had ever produced. 5 days in, he heard himself humming the waltz they had danced to in the library and stopped so abruptly that the ranch hand riding beside him asked if he was feeling ill. A week gone and sleep had become a stranger. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, knowing her room was just down the hall, knowing the connecting door between them stood open because he couldn't bring himself to close it. The door was an accusation, a mouth that wouldn't stop asking the question he couldn't answer. He worked. That was all he knew how to do when the world turned hostile. He rode out before dawn and came back after dark, checked fences that didn't need checking, moved cattle that didn't need moving, drove himself into the kind of exhaustion that should have brought sleep but didn't, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Not angry, not crying, worse than either of those things. Certain. Certain she was right and he was wrong. Certain she deserved better than a man who would rather lose her than risk being lost. The ranch hands noticed. Of course they did. These were men who read weather and livestock and land with the precision of scholars reading texts, and the change in their boss was as obvious as a storm front rolling in from the west. He made mistakes he would never normally make. Miscounted heads, forgot to order feed, signed a purchase agreement without reading the terms, something his father would have taken a strap to him for. Eli watched him with worried eyes but said nothing. There was nothing to say that Garrett didn't already know and was choosing to ignore. Ruth held her silence for 8 days. 8 days of watching her son hollow himself out at her dinner table, pushing food around his plate with the mechanical movements of a man who had forgotten why eating mattered. 8 days of biting her tongue, which for Ruth Ashford was roughly equivalent to holding her breath underwater. On the eighth night, she set down her fork with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet dining room. "You look terrible," murmured she. Garrett didn't look up from the potatoes he was rearranging into shapes that fooled no one. "Thank you, Mother. Your concern is touching. My concern is that you're dying by inches and too stubborn to admit you made a mistake." Her voice carried the particular sharpness of a woman who had run out of patience 3 days ago and was now operating on pure maternal fury. "Jessamine is gone. You got exactly what you claimed you wanted. So why do you look like a man attending his own funeral?" "I'm fine." "You are not fine. You haven't eaten a proper meal in a week. You work yourself half to death every day and still can't sleep. The hands are talking. They say you're distracted making errors you'd never normally make." She leaned forward, and her eyes held the kind of fierce love that doesn't bother being gentle. "You saved her from Drake's threats. Congratulations. Now you're both suffering, her alone in Denver with a broken heart, and you here destroying yourself, trying to pretend you don't care." "I do care." The words came out quiet, almost too quiet to hear. "That's why I let her go." "No," Ruth's palm hit the table. The silverware jumped. "You let her go because you're a coward." The word landed like a fist to the sternum. Garrett's hands went still on his fork and knife. He stared at his mother with an expression she hadn't seen since he was a boy, caught in a lie. "You didn't protect her, Garrett. You made her decisions for her, just like Drake tried to make your decisions for you." Ruth's voice climbed not with volume, but with the weight of truth she had been carrying for 8 days and could not carry one moment longer. "You became exactly what you were fighting against. A man who decides what's best for a woman without ever asking what she wants. That's not fair. Life isn't fair, and neither is love." She stood, her napkin falling to the floor like a flag of surrender she was refusing to wave. "Jessamine knew the risks. She chose you anyway. And instead of honoring that choice, you threw it back in her face and told her she wasn't capable of deciding what she could handle." She moved toward the door, then stopped, turned back, and said the thing that broke him. "Your father would be ashamed of you, not for falling in love, not for making mistakes, but for being too afraid to fight for your own happiness when a woman brave enough to love you was standing right in front of you begging you to let her." She left him alone at the table with his untouched meal and the sound of her words echoing off the walls like something thrown that hadn't finished bouncing. Garrett sat there for a long time, long enough for the candles to burn low and the food to go cold and the house to settle into the deep silence of a building that had given up trying to be warm. Then he pushed back from the table and walked to his study, the one room where he had always been able to think clearly. But the room betrayed him. Every surface held her ghost. The chair where she had sat while they built their elaborate lie, her back straight and her eyes clear and her voice steady as she helped him construct the fiction that would save them both. The desk where she had signed the contract with hands that wanted to shake but didn't because Jessamine Wren had never once let fear show when courage was what the moment required. The space near the fireplace where she had stood and told him she loved him, brave and certain, while he shook with fear. He moved to that spot now, pressed his palm flat against the cool stone of the mantel, and let himself think, really think, for the first time since she had walked down his drive and out of his life. He had told himself he was protecting Jessamine, being noble, sacrificing his own happiness so she could be safe from the consequences of his schemes. It was a good story, clean and honorable, and exactly the kind of narrative a man like him would construct to avoid looking at what was really underneath. But standing here in the place where she had offered him everything, Garrett could finally see what his mother had named and what Jessamine had seen long before either of them. He hadn't been protecting her. He had been protecting himself. Because if she had stayed, if they had fought Drake together and won, then Garrett would have had to believe he deserved happiness, would have had to trust that someone could see every broken, ugly, insufficient piece of him and choose to love him anyway. would have had to be vulnerable again, knowing that vulnerability had nearly destroyed him once before. It was easier to push her away, safer to be the one who ended things. Because if he was the one who let go, then at least the wound was self-inflicted. At least he controlled the blade. At least the devastation was predictable, familiar, the particular flavor of misery he had trained himself to swallow. Lorraine had been wrong about many things, but she had been right that he was rigid, that he held himself to impossible standards and punished himself for every failure and every perceived weakness, that he built walls so high even people who genuinely wanted to love him couldn't find a way over. He had spent 6 years proving her right, becoming exactly the cold, closed-off man she had described. And then Jessamine Wren had walked into his ballroom wearing a coat patched 3 times and a pair of boots held together by stubbornness, and she had looked past every wall he had built to the lonely, terrified man behind them. She had challenged him, called him out, told him he was worth loving with a certainty that terrified him more than Drake's threats ever could. She had loved him not despite his damage, but because she carried her own scars and understood that broken people could still build something whole. He'd had it, had everything he'd secretly wanted for years, and he'd thrown it away because accepting it required more courage than he thought he possessed. The realization brought him to his knees, not figuratively, actually physically to his knees on the study floor, with his back against the cold stone fireplace and his face in his hands. He had done to Jessamine exactly what Lorraine had done to him, made her feel like she wasn't enough, like loving him was a mistake she'd eventually regret, like she didn't have the right to choose her own risks and fight her own battles. The thought made him sick, made his stomach turn and his eyes burn with tears he had been refusing to shed for 8 days, for 6 years, for most of his adult life. Garrett didn't know how long he sat there on the floor wrestling with truths he had been burying for years, long enough for the fire to die, long enough for the cold to seep through his clothes and settle into his bones. But eventually something shifted. The desperate need to fix what he had broken pulled him to his feet and drove him to his desk. He pulled out paper, ink, and he began to write. Not a careful letter, not the measured, precise correspondence of a rancher conducting business. Just truth pouring out of him faster than his hand could move, raw and messy, and full of the things he should have said when she was standing in front of him instead of 2 days right away. He wrote about fear, about Lorraine's betrayal and how it had calcified into a belief so deep he'd stopped questioning it, that he was fundamentally unlovable, that anyone who got close enough to really see him would eventually arrive at the same conclusion and leave. He wrote about meeting Jessamine and how she had slipped past every defense without trying, how falling in love with her had been like watching dawn break after a night he thought would never end, how those 3 perfect days had terrified him more than anything in his life, because for the first time in 6 years, he had wanted something so badly that losing it would finish him. He wrote about understanding now that pushing her away hadn't been protection. It had been cowardice dressed in noble clothes, that he had chosen the familiar pain of loneliness over the terrifying possibility of joy, because at least loneliness was a wound he knew how to survive. And he wrote about being sorry, desperately, completely sorry, for making her feel like she wasn't worth fighting for when the truth was she was worth everything, and he had been too broken to see it. Dawn was breaking by the time he finished. His hand ached. His eyes burned. The letter was messy and emotional and nothing like anything he had ever written in his life. It was also the most honest thing he had put on paper. He sealed it, addressed it to Jessamine in Denver, then sat staring at it. A letter wasn't enough. Words on paper couldn't undo what he had done. If he was going to be brave, if he was finally going to fight for the woman he loved, he needed to do it face to face, needed to look her in the eyes and say everything the letter said and more, needed to give her the choice he had taken away. Walk away from him forever or give him one more chance, knowing exactly what kind of damaged, frightened man she would be choosing. Garrett stood, decision crystallizing into certainty, the way ice forms on still water, all at once, complete, irreversible. He would ride to Denver, find Jessamine, tell her everything his fear had kept locked away. And if she told him it was too late, that he had hurt her too deeply, that she couldn't trust a man who ran when things got hard, then he would accept that. But he would not accept it without fighting first. He was done accepting things without fighting first. He was still holding the letter, mentally calculating the ride to Denver, when his study door burst open. Eli stood in the doorway, breathing hard, his face tight with urgency. "Garrett, you need to come to town, now. I'm leaving for Denver." "No, you need to come to town." Eli crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped his brother's shoulder. "Drake is filing papers against the ranch, liens, injunctions, business interference claims. He's using every legal weapon he has to tear this place apart while you're too heartbroken to fight back." Cold dread flooded Garrett's veins. "What kind of liens?" "The kind that could cost you half the ranch by end of week if you don't respond." Eli's expression was grim. He waited, Garrett. Waited until Jessamine was gone and you'd signed that agreement and you were at your lowest. Then he struck. "You need to get to town and talk to Harrison before Drake finishes what he started." The timing was surgical. Drake had planned this with the patience of a man who understood that the best time to destroy your enemy was not when he was strong, but when he had already destroyed himself. Garrett looked at the letter in his hand, then at his brother. Denver was 2 days away. The courthouse was 2 hours. And if he didn't handle Drake's attack now, there would be no ranch to come home to, no future to offer Jessamine even if she gave him another chance. "I'll come," he said. "But Eli, the moment this is handled, I'm riding for Denver. If I have to fight Drake from horseback the entire way." Something that might have been hope crossed Eli's face. "About time you started fighting for something besides survival." They reached the territorial courthouse by mid-morning. Harrison, their lawyer, was already there, papers spread across the table, and a look on his face that suggested the news was every bit as bad as Eli had warned. Drake's strategy was thorough and vicious. He was claiming Garrett had violated the terms of the signed agreement by using ranch resources for personal purposes during the fraudulent marriage. Every meal Jessamine had eaten, every piece of clothing she had worn, every hour of staff time spent attending to her needs, all of it calculated, itemized, and presented as damages owed. $40,000, Harrison said. Not enough to bankrupt you outright, but enough to force you to, land dismiss workers, scale back operations for years. He's not trying to destroy you all at once. He's trying to bleed you slow. And unless you can prove that the marriage was legitimate, Harrison continued, looking at Garrett with the particular sympathy of a man who was about to deliver the worst part, that Jessamine was actually your wife and not part of a fraud scheme. He'll win. You signed an agreement admitting the marriage was fraudulent. That admission is all he needs. Garrett sank into a chair. The weight of every mistake he had made pressed down on him like earth shoveled onto a coffin. By trying to protect Jessamine, he had handed Drake the weapon to destroy everything else he cared about. The ranch, his workers and their families, his mother's security, all of it balanced on the edge of ruin because he had been too afraid to fight when fighting mattered most. There has to be a way. "Tais will," he said. "There is," a voice said from the doorway, "but you're not going to like it." Garrett's head snapped up. Jessamine Wren stood in the courthouse doorway. She wore the same blue cotton dress she had left in the one she had mended 6 times and would probably mend 6 more. Her hair was windblown from travel. There were shadows under her eyes that matched his own, and her jaw was set with the particular determination of a woman who had made a decision and intended to see it through regardless of what anyone, including the man she loved, thought about it. "What are you doing here?" The words came out rough, scraped raw by sleepless nights and unshed tears. "Saving you from yourself again." She walked into the room with the confidence of someone who had spent 2 days on a stagecoach planning exactly this moment. She moved to the table, scanned Harrison's papers with quick efficiency, and nodded as if confirming something she had already suspected. "Let me guess. He's using Garrett's admission of fraud to claim damages from the ranch." "That's correct," Harrison said, looking between them with the sharpening interest of a lawyer who sensed the case had just changed direction. "But if you're here, if you're willing to testify that the marriage was legitimate, I'll do better than testify." She reached into her worn bag, the same bag that held 3 needles and a spool of thread, and her mother's thimble, and pulled out a document. Their contract. The original agreement signed by both of them, detailing every term of their arrangement. "You kept it," Garrett said. "Of course I kept it." She looked at him, and her eyes held something between exasperation and a love so fierce it made his chest hurt. "I'm a seamstress, Garrett. I've spent my whole life making things fit. reinforcing weak seams. Did you really think I wouldn't keep a record of a contract worth thousands of dollars? But showing that contract proves the marriage started as an arrangement, Harrison pointed out carefully. Drake could argue. He could argue it started as a business arrangement, Jessamine corrected, which is perfectly legal. Marriages of convenience happen all the time, for financial benefit, for social advancement, for mutual protection. The law doesn't require love, it requires legal consent and proper documentation. She turned to Garrett. Her voice softened but didn't weaken. We had both. We entered into a legal arrangement in good faith. We honored every term, and then, completely separate from the business aspects, we fell in love. She paused, letting the words settle into the room like stones finding their place in a wall. That's not fraud. That's life. Harrison was nodding slowly at first, then with increasing energy. She's right. If we can demonstrate that the original arrangement was entered into honestly with clear terms and mutual benefit, and that no deception was intended toward any legal entity, then Drake's fraud claim collapses. The marriage may have started unconventionally, but it was always legal. And the backdated license, Garrett asked, the one question he had been dreading. Was a mistake born of panic, Jessamine said. Not malicious fraud. We were trying to make paperwork match a reality that already existed. Foolish and technically illegal, but not a conspiracy to harm anyone. She looked at Harrison with the steady gaze of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life and had long since stopped caring. Can you work with that? I can absolutely work with that. Harrison was already reaching for fresh paper, his pen practically trembling with professional excitement. We file a counterclaim, abuse of legal process, harassment, tortious interference with business relationships. We make Drake defend himself for a change instead of always being on the attack. There's one more thing, Jessamine said. She reached into her bag again and produced a sealed envelope. I stopped in Denver on my way here, spoke with someone I thought might be willing to tell the truth. She opened the envelope and laid its contents on the table. A signed, notarized statement from Penelope Kincaid. The room went silent. Garrett picked up the document. Read it once. Read it again. Then looked at Jessamine with an expression that combined disbelief, admiration, and the dawning realization that he had catastrophically underestimated the woman standing in front of him. Penelope Kincaid's statement was devastating in its simplicity. She confirmed under oath that she had never loved Garrett Ashford, that the engagement had been entirely arranged by her father and Senator Drake for political and financial purposes, that she had been pressured into participating and had felt enormous relief when the engagement ended despite the public humiliation, and that she bore no ill will toward Garrett or his wife and wished them well. How? Garrett asked. I wrote to her, Jessamine said. Woman to woman. No lawyers, no pressure. I told her the truth about our situation and asked if she'd be willing to share hers. She shrugged a small movement that contained multitudes. Penelope Kincaid spent her whole life being told what to do by powerful men. I think she was grateful someone finally asked what she actually wanted. Harrison was practically vibrating. This changes everything. Penelope's testimony destroys Drake's narrative completely. He built his entire case on the claim that Garrett defrauded the Kincaid family. But if the Kincaid daughter herself says the engagement was coerced and she's glad it ended, Drake has nothing. When can we file? Garrett asked. Tomorrow morning, and I'm going to enjoy every moment of it. The lawyer began organizing papers with the focused energy of a man who had just been handed the winning hand. Eli excused himself to send a telegram to Ruth, and Garrett and Jessamine stood facing each other across the table covered in documents that would determine their future with everything that mattered hanging in the space between them. I was coming for you, Garrett said. His voice was rough. This morning, before Eli arrived, I was packing to ride to Denver. Were you? He pulled the letter from his pocket. Creased and worn, now edges soft from being held too tightly through a 2-hour ride in a morning of legal devastation. I spent all night writing this, trying to find the words to explain why I'd been such a coward. Jessamine took it. Her eyes moved across the first few lines, and he watched tears gather and fall without any attempt to hide them. She read in silence for a long time, turning pages that were blotted with ink and honesty. Then she looked up. You really were coming. I finally understood what you'd been trying to tell me. That loving you didn't require me to be perfect or fearless. It just required me to show up. He moved around the table, closing the distance between them. I'm still afraid, Jessamine. I'm terrified, but I'm more afraid of living without you than I am of risking my heart. Good, she said, laughing through tears in a way that made his chest crack open. Because I'm terrified too, but we can be terrified together. I don't deserve you. No, she agreed, but I'm not going anywhere, so you'd better get used to it. He reached for her hands, held them like lifelines. I'm sorry for hurting you, for pushing you away, for deciding what was best for you without asking what you wanted, for being so convinced I was unlovable that I nearly destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me. Nearly, she repeated, not quite, because I'm stubborn and you're worth fighting for, even when you're too blind and scared to see it. He kissed her. In the middle of the territorial courthouse, surrounded by legal documents, in the lingering smell of ink in old wood. Not carefully, not with the measured restraint of a man protecting himself, with everything he had been holding back for weeks, months, maybe his entire adult life. When they broke apart, Eli was standing in the doorway with a grin wide enough to split his face. "About damn time," he said. "Can we go home now? Mother is going to be insufferable when she finds out she was right about everything." The ride back to the ranch felt different than any journey Garrett had taken before. Jessamine rode with him, settled against his chest, and they talked about everything. The fear they'd both carried, the mistakes they'd made, the future they wanted to build together. No more walls, no more careful distance, just honesty, raw and real and redemptive. Ruth met them at the door, took one look at their joined hands and Jessamine's tear-stained smiling face and said simply, "Thank heavens. I was about to ride to Denver myself and drag you both back here by your ears." "Your faith in us is touching, Mother," Garrett said dryly. "My faith is in Jessamine, who has more sense in her little finger than you do in your whole stubborn head." But she pulled Garrett into a fierce hug anyway, holding him the way she hadn't held him since he was a boy. "I'm proud of you, son, for finally being brave enough to fight for your own happiness." The hearing came 3 weeks later. Drake had fought their counterfiling with every resource at his disposal, but he was fighting a battle whose ground had shifted beneath his feet, and he hadn't realized it yet. The courtroom was small and warm, packed with spectators who had come to see the conclusion of the most talked-about scandal in Wyoming territory. Ranchers and their wives, workers from the Ashford Ranch who had taken the day off to show support, townspeople who had been following the saga through gossip and newspaper reports. Even Delia Drake was there, sitting in the back row with an expression that suggested she was reconsidering some things about her father. Garrett sat at the respondents' table with Harrison beside him, his expression calm, his hands steady, the hands of a man who had finally stopped running. But the case was not won by Garrett Ashford. It was won by Jessamine Wren. She took the witness stand in her blue cotton dress, the one she had mended so many times the original fabric was more memory than a material. She wore no jewelry except the gold ring on her left hand, worn smooth by generations of Ashford women who had loved the men they married. She told the truth, not the version they had constructed in Garrett's study all those weeks ago, not the careful fiction built on real foundations. The actual truth. All of it. The letter from Ruth that brought her to the ranch. The engagement party. Briggs grabbing her arm in front of 100 people. Garrett's desperate lies spoken to save them both. The contract with its careful terms. The money. The arrangement that was supposed to be just business and became the most real thing either of them had ever known. She spoke clearly and without shame because she had nothing to be ashamed of. Two people had made an agreement that benefited them both. They had honored its terms with integrity and good faith. And then in the way that life sometimes does, when you stop trying to control it, something unexpected had grown in the space between the rules. "Senator Drake wants you to believe we committed fraud," she said, addressing the judge with the steady gaze of a woman who had spent her life being underestimated and had finally decided to use it. "But the only fraud here is his claim that love has to look a certain way to be real. My husband and I found each other in unusual circumstances. We built our relationship on honesty and mutual respect, and we fell in love despite our best efforts to prevent it." She paused, let the silence hold, let it fill the courtroom like water fills a vessel, finding every corner, every crack. "That's not fraud, Your Honor. That's the most honest thing either of us has ever done." Penelope Kincaid testified next. She was calm and composed, dressed simply, her testimony delivered with the quiet relief of a woman finally saying what she had wanted to say for months. She confirmed everything: the arranged engagement, her father's pressure, Drake's involvement, her own relief when it ended. "I never loved Mr. Ashford," she said simply, "and he never loved me. We both deserve better than what our fathers planned for us. I'm glad he found it, even if the way he found it was unconventional." Drake sat through both testimonies with his face going progressively darker, the particular shade of a man watching his carefully constructed case disintegrate in real time. His lawyer tried to redirect, tried to cast doubt, tried to find the cracks that had always been there before in every story, every witness, every defense. There were no cracks, not anymore. The truth, it turned out, was harder to break than any lie they had ever told. The judge ruled decisively, dismissed every one of Drake's claims, ordered him to pay damages for abuse of legal process, issued an injunction prohibiting further harassment of the Ashford family, and noted for the record that while the court did not condone the backdating of legal documents, the marriage between Garrett and Jessamine Ashford appeared to be in every meaningful sense legitimate. Drake left the courthouse looking 20 years older. His political allies, suddenly scarce, his reputation for invincibility shattered by a seamstress from Denver who had walked into a courtroom with a mended dress and an unmendable determination to fight for the man she loved. Garrett felt no triumph, only relief so profound it weakened his knees, and gratitude that defied language for the woman who had refused to let him destroy himself. They stood on the courthouse steps in the afternoon light, his arm around her waist, Ruth and Eli behind them, and Jessamine looked up at him with eyes that held no anger, no resentment, only the calm certainty of someone who had chosen to stay. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Garrett said, turning to face her, fully taking both her hands in his. "We get married, really married. Not a secret ceremony, not a business arrangement. A real wedding where I stand up in front of everyone who matters and promise to love you for the rest of my life." "We're already married," Jessamine pointed out, but she was smiling. "We have documents and everything." "I don't want documents. I want to give you a celebration. Want everyone to see that you chose me and that I'm going to spend every day for the rest of my life proving I deserve that choice." He pressed his forehead against hers in that gesture that had become theirs, intimate, and anchoring, a way of saying I'm here without using words. "Marry me again, Jessamine. This time with joy instead of fear. This time knowing exactly what we're promising each other." "Yes," she said, laughing and crying simultaneously, the way she always did when happiness hit her too hard and too fast. "As many times as you need until you finally believe I'm not going anywhere." "I believe it now," he said. "You fought Drake. You fought me. You fought for us when I was too much of a coward to fight for myself. If that's not proof of forever, nothing is." They married again 6 weeks later. The small white chapel behind the general store in town, the same one where they had attended that first awkward church social, was filled beyond capacity. Half the territory came, not out of curiosity this time, not to gawk at the scandal, but because the story of Garrett and Jessamine Ashford had become something people wanted to witness. Proof that love could grow in unlikely soil, that second chances were real, that being brave enough to fight for what mattered could actually work. Ranchers and workers and their families filled the pews. Women who had once whispered behind their hands now wiped tears from their eyes. Men who had doubted the marriage now shook Garrett's hand and meant it. Even Tilda was there, sitting in the third row, in her best dress, beaming like a woman who had known all along how this story would end. Jessamine wore a dress she had made herself. Ivory silk with tiny pearl buttons, simple and elegant, and sewn with the kind of care she brought to everything she touched. Her hands had made something beautiful the way they always did. The way they had made something beautiful out of a desperate stranger's lie and a contract that was never meant to hold love, but held it anyway. Garrett wore his best suit and looked at her as she walked toward him down the narrow aisle like she was every answer to every question he had stopped asking years ago. When the minister asked if he took Jessamine to be his wife, Garrett said, "I do, with my whole heart, for as long as we both shall live." When asked if she took Garrett to be her husband, Jessamine said, "I do, with eyes wide open to all his flaws, because I love him anyway." The congregation laughed. Ruth cried openly and without apology the way she did everything. Eli served as best man and gave a speech about stubborn brothers, and the women brave enough to love them that made even the old ranchers in the back row reach for their handkerchiefs. They danced that evening in the church hall, the same waltz they had practiced in the library all those weeks ago, when every step had been pulling them closer to a truth neither was ready to name. But now every movement was pure joy. No performance, no careful distance, no contract dictating how close they could stand or what they were allowed to feel. Just two people holding each other in a room full of witnesses, finally honest about what lived between them. Happy, Garrett murmured as they swayed. Terrified, Jessamine admitted. But yes, happy. Same. Terrified and happy, and so in love with you I can barely breathe. He kissed her temple. Thank you for not giving up on me, for coming back when I was too stubborn and too scared to come for you. Thank you for finally believing you were worth fighting for, she replied. They built their life together after that. Not perfectly. Perfection was for people who had never been broken and therefore had never learned how strong the mended places could be. Garrett still had days when fear crept in, days when he caught himself stacking bricks again, building walls out of old habit and older wounds. But Jessamine would see it happening, would call it by name with the gentle firmness that had become their private language, and he would put the bricks down, tear the wall apart before it could set. Sometimes it took an hour. Sometimes it took a conversation that lasted until dawn. But he always chose in the end to keep his heart open because she had taught him that the risk was worth the reward, and he believed her now. Jessamine still had moments of doubt. Mornings when she woke in that beautiful house and wondered if she truly belonged there, or if the girl from Denver with the patch coat and the $4 fortune was still just playing dress-up in someone else's life. But Garrett would hold her and tell her all the ways she had changed him, saved him, made him believe that second chances weren't just for other people, that she wasn't just his wife. She was his home. She opened a seamstress shop in town. Not in Denver as the contract had originally specified, but right here in Wyoming, where she could see the mountains from her workroom window and walk home to the ranch in the evenings. She hired women like she had been, desperate, talented, needing someone to look at their worn-out clothes and calloused hands and see not what they lacked, but what they were capable of becoming. She taught them to sew, and in teaching them, she taught them what Ruth Ashford had taught her, that your worth had nothing to do with the clothes you wore or the money in your pocket. 3 years after that second wedding, Jessamine sat in the library where they had learned to dance and told Garrett she was pregnant. He cried. Not the careful, controlled emotion of a man protecting his dignity, but real tears streaming down the face of a man who had spent years believing he would never have this, would never deserve this, was too damaged and too cold and too rigid to be trusted with something as fragile and sacred as a family. Their daughter was born in spring, when the Wyoming hills turned green and the world outside their windows looked like the beginning of something. Tiny, perfect, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. They named her Ruth after the grandmother who had believed in both of them before they believed in each other. Garrett held his daughter in the same study where he had once signed a contract promising never to love, and he understood something his mother had tried to tell him years ago. That love wasn't about being perfect or fearless. It was about showing up every day and choosing vulnerability over armor, choosing trust over certainty, choosing to keep your heart open even when every scar you carried was begging you to close it. On their 5th anniversary, Garrett took Jessamine back to the veranda where he had kissed her in the rain, where she had told him she loved him and he had been too afraid to believe it, where they had stood in the storm and chosen each other over the safety of being alone. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, yellowed now, creased from years of handling. Their original contract, the one she had used to save them both in that courtroom. I kept it, he said, after everything. Couldn't bring myself to destroy it. It felt important somehow. Jessamine took it and read through the terms they had agreed to in another lifetime. $5,000, a shop in Denver. No romantic feelings, just business. She laughed. The sound was rich and warm and full of everything they had survived to arrive at this moment. We broke every term, she said. We honored the ones that mattered. He put his arm around her. I cleared your debts. You got your shop just closer than Denver. And we both got our freedom. Freedom to choose to stay instead of being obligated to. That was the most important term of all. Jessamine traced the line about no romantic feelings, the words that had been written as a wall and had become instead the door they both eventually walked through. This was always a lie, she said softly, even when we wrote it. I think I was already falling in love with you when we wrote it, Garrett admitted. The rule wasn't to prevent feelings. It was to protect me from admitting I had them. She handed the contract back. What should we do with it? Garrett looked at the paper that had started everything. The bargain struck in desperation between two strangers who had nothing in common except the particular loneliness of people who had survived too much and trusted too little. The lie that had taken root and grown into the truest thing either of them had ever known. He walked to the edge of the veranda and tore it into pieces. Let the Wyoming wind take them, carrying scraps of old promises across the ranch land and into the gathering dusk like seeds scattered from an open hand. We don't need it anymore, he said. We never really did. It was just an excuse, a way for two scared people to let themselves be close without admitting they wanted to be. Best excuse I ever made, Jessamine said. Best bargain I ever struck. He pulled her close, held her the way he'd learned to hold her over these years together. Not carefully, not like something that might break, but firmly, completely, like something he intended to keep for the rest of his life and beyond. Thank you, he said, for refusing to let me hide, for fighting when I couldn't, for coming back when I didn't deserve it. You always deserved it, Jessamine said. You just needed someone stubborn enough to keep proving it until you believed. I believe it now. They stood together as the last light faded over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in the same shades of amber and rose that Jessamine had seen from her window on that first night when she was just a seamstress with $4 in a satchel full of needles and no idea that she was about to walk into the rest of her life. Inside the house, their daughter was laughing. Ruth was singing something off-key in the kitchen. Eli was visiting with his new wife, a school teacher from Sheridan, who was every bit as headstrong as the Ashford men required. And the world was messy and complicated and absolutely, completely, irreplaceably good. The bargain had been struck years ago in desperation and fear between a man who believed he was unlovable and a woman who believed she was worthless. Both of them wrong. Both of them about to prove it. What grew from that unlikely beginning was not a perfect love story. It was better than perfect. It was real, built on honesty that had to be learned, strengthened by choices that had to be made again every single day, sustained by the understanding that love wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to stay anyway, to show up, to keep your heart open, to trust that the person standing next to you would still be there tomorrow. Not because a contract required it, not because the terms demanded it, but because they chose it, freely, fully, with eyes wide open to every flaw and every risk and every beautiful, terrifying possibility. That was the truth Jessamine Wren had taught Garrett Ashford. That was the truth that saved them both. And if you're watching from somewhere in this wide world tonight, remember this. The best things in life don't come with guarantees. They come with courage, with the willingness to say 5 words to a stranger in a ballroom and mean them more than you've ever meant anything. Sometimes the lie you tell the world becomes the truest thing you've ever known. All you have to do is be brave enough to let it.